Is this working?
It's a little low, but
Yes.
Okay. Our next speaker is Roger Wareham. Roger is a spokesperson for the December 12th International Secretariat based in New York. The December 12th movement is an anti-imperialist organization in solidarity with the national liberation struggles in Africa and has focused on solidarity and ending the sanctions in Zimbabwe. Now, Roger is also a human rights attorney. That means real human rights.
real.
It takes a real redefining these days and has also traveled many times to Zimbabwe. So, Roger.
Well, I'll just pick up from where John just left off in terms of sanctions are measures of wartime and crimes against humanity. How many people have heard of Amilcar Cabral? Okay, most people in here have not. And I raise that because Amilcar Cabral was one of the leading theoreticians. He was the head of the liberation struggle in Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde Islands, and he was assassinated by the Portuguese. But one of the things he said that are very prescient and relevant, he said, revolutionaries can claim no lies, tell no lies, or claim easy victories. And I raise that because one of the weaknesses of the movement in this country and of the left is that when people hear, when you say the word sanctions, people think of Cuba and they think of Venezuela and they think of Iraq. And as Sarah said in her introduction, they do not think of Africa in general, nor do they think of Zimbabwe in particular. And I raise it because it's very important. Last night, as it was mentioned, we had a program commemorating the anniversary of the assassination of Malcolm X. And we decided that for that program, we were going to deal with the question of sanctions in Zimbabwe. And people will say, well, what's the connection between Malcolm X and sanctions in Zimbabwe? And that some people said that, some people do. But that Malcolm X, in terms of his growth and development, was a Pan-Africanist. And Malcolm X understood the connection between the struggle of African people in diaspora, particularly in the United States, and the African continent. And that we could not succeed with one without the other. And that was one of the reasons that he was assassinated. He was drawing those ties. He was putting the struggle on the level of human rights. And we thought Zimbabwe, or we think Zimbabwe is very important because Zimbabwe is the only African country to this day which has taken the stance of returning its land from the people who stole it and returning it to its people. And it's because of that that they've come under the sanctions of the United States. If you look through if you look through the media from 1980 when Zimbabwe had its first election and President Robert Mugabe was elected president, through 2001, you'd see a sort of arc of President Mugabe was listed, was lauded by the West as the ideal democratic African presidents. They had elections, all that went on. But part of the agreement that led to the elections in Zimbabwe, there was a compromise that was made that said that if you stop the armed struggle, because ZANU-PF, the liberation struggle forces in Zimbabwe, were about to take the capital, Harare. And the response of the whites was that they were bombing the hell out of the countries that were giving support, Zambia, Mozambique. They were bombing the civilian population. So in order to shorten that, a compromise was reached, the Lancaster House in Great Britain, and part of that compromise was that whites would have a golden parachute for about 20 years in terms of representation in Parliament outside of their percentage of the population, and that there would be a fair, what do they call it, in terms of land, that people,
willing seller, willing buyer.
Yeah, willing seller, willing buyer in terms of recovering the land. The Zimbabweans' position was that they were not going to pay whites to recover the land that had been stolen from them. And that any money that would be going to the white settlers would come from subsidies from the UK and the United States.
Right.
At our program last night, we had the former ambassador of the AU to the United States, Dr. Arikana Chiamburi-Kwao, who spoke. She was recently relieved of her position as the AU ambassador to the United States because she spoke out too clearly, too frequently, and too truthfully around the role of imperialism in Africa. And she said, people don't even understand how whites got the land in Zimbabwe. Once they came in Cecil Rhodes and they took the land, but particularly after World War II, whites were veterans, European veterans of the World War II, were just given land. So they said what happened was the Cecil Rhodes and his descendants, they divided the land up into regions. The two regions were the most fertile, where the land was arable, I mean, was beautiful. The African population, which was 95% of the population, was pushed to the least arable land, almost like dirt and desert. And a white settler would ride his horse as far as he could in each direction, east, west, north, and south, until either he got too tired or his horse got too tired, and that would be the boundary of his land. And so they had thousands of hectares of land. So when, after the Lancaster House, after the war ended, after the whites got the golden parachute, when it came time for willing seller and willing buyer, the United States and the UK, now the United States' only nickel in that dime was that it was their kith and kin who were part of this, because the United States had no relationship to Zimbabwe or northern southern Rhodesia, so it could only be their ties of, that's our kith and kin, they need support. When it came time to fulfill that, both the United States and the UK said, oh well, that was something that was done under Margaret Thatcher and Reagan, so we don't have to honor that, as if treaties were not, they didn't go along, you know, this is great democracy, treaties, this is the land of law, so if there's a treaty, it's supposed to be honored. It wasn't tied to whoever was the president who signed it. So they refused to deal with that. The Zimbabwean masses, particularly the war veterans' position was, we did not fight this war, we did not lose thousands and hundreds of our people to be able to have a parliament and a vote. We fought it for the land. And so they took initial steps to take the land back. The government, ZANU-PF, President Mugabe, said we're going to do this in an orderly way. And so the government took the position, we're going to return the land to the people. It was at that point in time where Robert Mugabe went from the democratic African Thomas Jefferson to the black hippie, like overnight. Trying to get back in the media. At that point, the British put sanctions on Zimbabwe. The United States put sanctions on Zimbabwe, and the United States sanctions were even more insidious because the United States hid it under the guise of democracy. The Zimbabwe Democracy and Economic Recovery Act of 2001 said that when democracy is restored in Zimbabwe, which ignores the fact that they had had national elections and regional elections every 4 or 5 years since 1980, when democracy is restored to Zimbabwe, then the United States will withdraw the sanctions that we were imposing. The sanctions that they imposed was no bilateral loans, no loans from the World Bank or the IMF, because the United States controlled that. And so basically it was a worldwide embargo against Zimbabwe. The Zimbabwe Democracy and Economic Recovery Act was co-sponsored by Jesse Helms and Hillary Clinton. And the objective, as has been said, was to create regime change, to create conditions so bad that the people would overthrow the government. And that led, over the period of time, in 2008, there was runaway inflation in Zimbabwe that was probably what had happened in the Weimar Republic back in the early 20th century. In 2018, under President Trump, the Zimbabwe Democracy Act has been actually, it was amended to make it even tighter. This one, the latest one, said there's got to be guaranteed compensation to the white farmers who had the land taken from them.
Oh.
they have been unsuccessful in terms of affecting regime change. All of the things that get laid out in the different countries in terms of the effects in terms of medicine and all the effects is to make conditions for the masses of people worse. At this point in time, particularly, it was mentioned in AU, the AU hasn't taken a position in terms of lifting the sanctions because the AU is filled with 54 African countries. A whole bunch of them are still under the sway of their former colonizers. But the Southern African Development Community, SADC, did take that position. And last year at their summit, they said that we're taking the position of lifting the sanctions. On October 25th, they had a day where it was a kickoff of a campaign to say that all of those countries who are part of SADC, we're going to have a continual campaign to lift the sanctions. It's because, and not only because of the effect on Zimbabwe, but they are a community. They are a community, and they're affected by it. I'm near the end of my time, so I just want to say this very quickly. There's a growing movement in support for that, and support of lifting the sanctions. It's very important in this country that this grouping and the people that it affects understands that and lifts that up in their work so that when people think of sanctions, they don't just think of Cuba or Venezuela or Iraq and Iran. If they think of Africa, they think of Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe is important, and one of the reasons why the United States and the UK and the West and the EU have focused on it is because of the precedent it has set. The land problem has not been resolved in Africa, it has not been resolved, particularly in Southern Africa. The movement has progressed to the point where Cyril Ramaphosa, the president of Southern Africa, has taken the position that they are considering taking land back without compensation because he understands that if he doesn't do that, he's going to be overthrown by his people. So I think it's important that we understand here and that the movement here take that up and push that. So I will just leave it at that and maybe we can deal with some questions. Thank you very much.